While you possess a highly distinct individuality, you also fit within a specific framework of character classification. Embarking on the profound path of self-realization requires you to uncover your genuine and fundamental disposition. Engaging in this internal exploration grants you a deeper comprehension of human nature's profound intricacies, ultimately enhancing the connections you share with your own mind, the people around you, and the broader environment. Within the pages of his seminal 1921 publication, Psychological Types, the renowned Swiss psychiatrist and psychologist Carl Jung formally introduced the now famous concepts of introversion and extraversion. The author noted that this manuscript was the culmination of almost 2 decades of hands-on psychological practice, evolving organically from his extensive clinical observations of nervous disorders and interactions with individuals across all social strata. Furthermore, Jung emphasized that these insights were profoundly shaped by his personal relationships with both allies and adversaries, culminating in a rigorous evaluation of his own unique mental traits. The primary catalyst for Jung's exploration into character categorization was his intense desire to decipher the stark contrasts between the psychological frameworks proposed by Freud and Adler. He deduced that Freud's pleasure principle and Adler's will to power were actually manifestations of their own distinct psychological orientations. Within Freud's paradigm, external entities, both inanimate items and living individuals, hold paramount significance, acting either as catalysts or barriers to your pursuit of gratification, with a substantial focus placed specifically upon parental figures. In this Freudian model, your personal sense of self is treated as largely negligible, functioning merely as a repository for internal anxieties. Conversely, Adler viewed external elements as oppressive forces that constantly inundate the individual, driving you to conquer feelings of inadequacy by actively establishing your own value and place in society. Jung concluded that these divergent theories existed simply because Freud operated primarily as an extrovert, whereas Adler functioned as an introvert, demonstrating how your destiny might be shaped by outward fascinations, while another's path is forged by their internal mental landscape. The foundational distinction between these two archetypes lies in the direction of their mental energy. The extrovert projects their attention outward toward external reality, while the introvert directs their focus inward toward their personal subjective experience. If you lean toward the introverted spectrum, your inherently contemplative disposition compels you to thoroughly analyze situations prior to taking any physical steps. This inherent caution and skepticism toward outside elements often breed a sense of hesitation, frequently making it a struggle for you to seamlessly integrate into the demands of the surrounding environment. On the other hand, the extrovert maintains an inherently enthusiastic connection with the outside world, finding themselves naturally drawn to external stimuli and endlessly captivated by novel, unfamiliar scenarios. Operating on the general principle of acting swiftly and evaluating the consequences later, this personality type heavily contrasts with the deeply reflective nature of their inward-looking counterpart. Jung elegantly illustrated this dichotomy using classical mythology, comparing the profoundly contemplative introvert to Prometheus, the embodiment of forethought, and likening the remarkably impulsive extrovert to Epimetheus, the representation of afterthought. For the extroverted individual, the external environment acts as an irresistible magnetic force, constantly pulling at their psychological tendencies and dictating their overall orientation. Because your attention is perpetually locked onto your surroundings, the people and items around you provide a seemingly limitless source of intrigue, often preventing you from ever seeking fulfillment from within. The inherent peril of this outward fixation is the very real possibility of becoming completely absorbed by external factors, eventually losing your own distinct sense of identity in the process. Consider the scenario of a dedicated entrepreneur whose entire existence revolves obsessively around the perpetual growth of their corporate enterprise. Over an extended period, this relentless external drive frequently triggers severe psychological or physiological distress, which paradoxically serves a balancing function by violently redirecting the person's focus back inward. When pushed to the brink, the typical neurotic manifestation for an extrovert is hysteria, characterized by wildly unregulated emotional outbursts and an incessant, desperate compulsion to command attention and leave a lasting mark on observers. Conversely, if you operate as an introvert, your own subjective experience remains the focal point of your existence, functioning as a gravitational center that attempts to pull external reality inward. Yet, labeling this profoundly internalized perspective as merely narcissistic or intensely self-centered would be a massive misrepresentation of Jung's actual theories. He vividly contrasted these notoriously guarded and impenetrable individuals with their highly gregarious counterparts, noting how the latter perpetually engage with society, whether through amiable friendships or bitter conflicts, while always remaining fundamentally tethered to those external relationships. The distribution of these specific psychological profiles appears entirely arbitrary, often resulting in siblings within the exact same household displaying fiercely opposite temperaments. Jung firmly believed that your specific categorization is not a product of deliberate choice, but rather stems from deep-seated, instinctual drives that point to a fundamental biological bedrock. While the profound impact of parental guidance cannot be ignored, you are certainly not born as a blank slate. Under typical circumstances, your innate physiological predispositions will ultimately dictate your character trajectory, overriding the pressures of your surrounding environment. Crucially, while a single operational mode will organically take the lead in your daily life, it is impossible to exist as an exclusively introverted or extroverted being. You inherently harbor both capacities, with your label merely reflecting the dominant trait. For the deeply inward-focused individual, outward-facing tendencies remain suppressed, just as the highly social person buries their contemplative side in obscurity. This neglected psychological facet ultimately merges into your shadow self, the hidden reservoir of unrecognized traits, untapped capabilities, and the profound experiences that constitute your unlived existence. To perfectly encapsulate this dynamic, Jung provided a compelling illustration involving two young friends exploring the countryside who suddenly stumble upon a magnificent estate they wish to explore. The introverted companion instinctively recoils from the idea, immediately imagining a hostile reception filled with aggressive guard dogs, harsh financial penalties, and strict law enforcement. In sharp contrast, the extroverted peer casually suggests simply requesting entry, their mind actively conjuring delightful scenarios involving hospitable caretakers and the thrilling prospect of a romantic encounter. Upon crossing the threshold of the fortress, the pair discovers that the interior holds merely a few chambers, housing an assortment of ancient texts. Such a discovery proves to be an immense delight for the more inwardly focused companion, prompting ecstatic exclamations as he eagerly rushes to examine the historical artifacts. Any previous timidity immediately evaporates as the introvert becomes completely absorbed by the fascinating objects before him, entirely oblivious to his companion's existence. Conversely, his outgoing counterpart quickly succumbs to profound boredom and struggles to stifle his yawns. As the passion of the former intensifies, the morale of the latter plummets rapidly, since these antiquated documents merely evoke memories of vast libraries, which in turn bring to mind the dreadful monotony of university lectures and grueling examinations. Ultimately, this location transforms into an absolute wonderland for one individual while inflicting mind-numbing dullness upon the other. You can clearly observe a fascinating reversal where the initially hesitant introvert refuses to leave the premises, whereas the extrovert bitterly regrets ever stepping foot inside the imposing structure. In this peculiar scenario, the inward-looking youth adopts an outward focus, and the naturally outgoing individual withdraws into himself. Yet these flipped temperaments express themselves through rather poorly adapted social behaviors. Specifically, the fascinated scholar completely fails to recognize his companion's sheer apathy, while the disappointed adventurer, having been robbed of his anticipated romantic escapade, turns sullen and totally disregards his partner's sheer jubilation. Prior to penetrating the fortress walls, these two young men existed in a delightful state of mutual reliance, relishing a balanced dynamic where their inherent dispositions perfectly offset one another. Their shared desire to explore the grounds was facilitated by a healthy synergy. The cautious skepticism of the quieter friend proved highly beneficial to his bold companion, just as the extrovert's proactive willingness to seek permission served the needs of both. Through extensive clinical observation, Jung determined that human beings can be categorized even further based on 4 fundamental psychological functions, specifically identified as thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. To break this down simply, sensation confirms the mere existence of an entity. Thinking allows us to analyze its identity and assign it a specific label. Feeling determines its underlying value, and intuition grants us a profound grasp of its future potential and practical applications. Achieving a well-rounded comprehension of our own identities and the surrounding environment demands the active engagement of all 4 of these essential perceptual pathways. Within this framework, thinking and feeling are classified as rational processes, whereas sensation and intuition fall under the umbrella of irrational mechanisms. Furthermore, any of these operational categories can manifest through either an introverted or extroverted lens, which are known formally as attitude types. While an individual's attitude type dictates whether their primary focus is directed toward external objects or internal subjectivity, their function type governs the specific flow and distribution of their psychological energy, or libido. It is crucial to understand that Jung's definition of libido diverges significantly from Freud's strictly sexual interpretation, expanding instead to encompass the absolute entirety of a person's psychic energy reserves. He described this force as a raw craving or urge that remains completely unrestrained by moral codes or external authorities, representing human appetite in its most primal, unadulterated form. Viewed through a biological lens, this foundational essence comprises fundamental corporeal requirements, such as the drive for sustenance, hydration, rest, and reproduction, alongside potent emotional conditions or affects. Returning to the rational realm, the processes of thinking and feeling rely heavily upon our personal decision-making frameworks and are strongly guided by our capacity for judgment. The faculty of thinking pertains directly to cognitive processing, reflecting our inherent talent for dissecting data and forming sound, logical conclusions based on hard facts. Individuals dominated by this trait excel at resolving complex dilemmas, habitually evaluating situations by questioning their own intellectual stance on the matter, which allows them to detach emotionally and maintain a highly objective perspective. On the opposite end of the rational spectrum lies the feeling function, which empowers you to assess both your own inner emotional landscape and the sentiments of those around you, ultimately determining whether a concept or object merits acceptance or rejection based on its perceived worth. Those who rely predominantly on this mechanism habitually navigate life by questioning their emotional response to any given circumstance. Consider a scenario where an emotionally guided student submits an assignment. If the instructor praises the work but highlights a single trivial error in a brief section, the student might spiral into severe distress, dramatically declaring the entire project ruined and worthy only of the incinerator. This intense reaction can easily persist, utterly unmitigated by the professor's gentle reassurance that a simple, single-sentence correction would resolve the issue entirely. Conversely, a fiercely logical thinker might struggle profoundly to articulate their sentiments in a conventional or timely fashion when social expectations demand it. Such an individual might weep in private upon learning of a companion's passing, yet find themselves completely incapable of uttering a single sympathetic syllable when standing face to face with the grieving widow, inadvertently projecting an aura of callousness despite having genuinely grieved in solitude just moments prior. Within casual conversation, society frequently conflates the concept of feeling with raw emotion, often labeling sentiments as utterly irrational the moment they happen to contradict established factual evidence. From a strictly psychological standpoint, nevertheless, practitioners classify both thinking and feeling as fundamentally rational operations, with the latter serving as the foundational bedrock for our critical fight-or-flight survival responses. While you can often generate feelings voluntarily through deliberate contemplation, genuine emotions strike involuntarily, seizing control of your mental state without requiring any conscious permission. In specialized terminology, an emotion is more accurately described as an affect, which characterizes a visceral reaction accompanied by distinct bodily symptoms and significant disruptions to normal cognitive processing. Such an involuntary outburst typically stems from an activated complex, a specific phase Jung introduced to describe a tightly knitted cluster of profoundly charged concepts or mental imagery. The pioneering psychoanalyst emphasized that these psychological constellations are not inherently detrimental, even though their behavioral consequences frequently prove troublesome. Much like unseen molecules form the structure of tangible matter, complexes serve as the foundational architecture of the human mind and the wellspring of all our emotional experiences. Beyond the structured boundaries of rational thought and feeling, you possess irrational functions that act as your primary conduits for experiencing the present moment, driven entirely by raw perception rather than deliberate intellectual reflection. These essential intake mechanisms, specifically identified as sensation and intuition, dictate exactly how you absorb and process incoming stimuli from the surrounding environment. It is absolutely vital to clarify that when Jung utilized the term irrational, he was not describing a process that inherently defies logic, but rather one that operates on a plane entirely outside the scope of traditional reasoning. Sensation embodies your capacity to grasp immediate reality, utilizing the 5 biological avenues of sight, sound, scent, flavor, and physical contact, engaging directly with the tangible world exactly as it exists. Individuals who favor this perceptive mode tend to be exceptionally grounded pragmatists, fully anchored in their current surroundings and intensely invigorated by the continuous stream of sensory input they encounter daily. Certain individuals show little enthusiasm for deeply philosophical or theoretical subjects, preferring the tangible. Conversely, your intuition serves as the profound capacity to decipher intricate tapestries of meaning that extend far beyond raw sensory input, allowing you to recognize hidden potentials woven into your current reality. Sometimes, an idea materializes in your mind fully formed and entirely coherent, leaving you completely unable to articulate exactly how that revelation was born, much like experiencing a sudden, inexplicable premonition about future events. You might experience this inner knowing as an unprompted burst of clarity from deep within, or it could be sparked by intensely observing the emotional currents of another person. Consider an intuitive individual shaping a rough, imperfect animal out of clay. Rather than focusing on the physical flaws and attempting to sculpt a more accurate representation, they will likely launch into a passionate discourse about integrating this creative process into global educational systems to elevate humanity. Ultimately, while physical sensation relies entirely on the tangible world, your intuitive faculties operate through the unconscious mind, immersing you in a conceptual realm driven by sweeping metaphors rather than concrete facts. By merging the 2 fundamental attitudes with the 4 primary cognitive functions, we arrive at 8 distinct personality paradigms, each defined by unique characteristics: extroverted thinking, introverted thinking, extroverted feeling, introverted feeling, extroverted sensation, introverted sensation, extroverted intuition, and introverted intuition. While Carl Jung explicitly cautioned that organizing human nature around introversion, extroversion, and these core functions was merely one of many valid approaches, he undoubtedly unearthed a profound psychological treasure. This quaternary architecture of the human mind endures as an incredibly powerful framework, offering you a remarkable lens through which to comprehend your own identity, navigate your interpersonal relationships, and make sense of the broader world. The brilliant psychoanalyst experienced a profound revelation when he realized that his intuitive theories were universally echoed throughout ancient mythology and religious iconography, which consistently featured this identical fourfold structural model. Decades later, his foundational theories directly sparked the creation of the widely recognized Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI, an assessment designed to categorize individuals into 16 distinct profiles. The architects behind this popular questionnaire believed that the original academic texts were far too dense for everyday readers, prompting them to distill these incredibly nuanced psychological concepts into a highly digestible format for the general public. Unfortunately, by simplifying such profound material, you run the very real risk of fundamentally misunderstanding and cheapening the vast intricacies of human character. It remains highly debatable whether the original theorist would have endorsed these modern assessments, especially since he actively warned against using his typologies as rigid manuals for judging others. Relying solely on standardized questionnaires can be incredibly deceptive and potentially harmful, as these static snapshots completely fail to account for continuous personal evolution or the ways in which your true nature might be masked by deep-seated family expectations and environmental pressures. At the very heart of analytical psychology lies the concept of individuation, a continuous, lifelong journey where you actively pull hidden elements from your unconscious into the light of awareness, ultimately achieving true psychological maturity. Provided you remain cautious of its limitations, a framework like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator can function beautifully as an introspective compass, offering you a navigational chart when you feel adrift in life. Yet, a map is practically useless if you have no intended destination. Your ultimate mission is to pinpoint the exact coordinates of your authentic self, utilizing this typological understanding to unlock the absolute fullness of your being. You must remember that this theoretical model was never intended to be a rigid system for cataloging traits or slapping permanent labels onto yourself and those around you. Rather, it serves as a purely psychological orienting device, functioning exactly like a navigational compass, helping you find your bearings in a vast wilderness. When you habitually rely on one specific cognitive capability over the others, it solidifies into your primary or dominant function, a process that naturally begins in childhood as you instinctively gravitate toward your innate talents, while avoiding areas of perceived weakness, inadvertently amplifying your cognitive one-sidedness. External pressures soon enter the equation, such as relatives insisting that a child with a knack for building blocks is destined to become an engineer, thereby reinforcing those natural gifts, while allowing alternative aspects of their personality to slowly wither. This developmental narrowing is completely inevitable and can even be highly advantageous, provided your authentic psychological preferences are the ones actually being nurtured. While you possess the capacity to bring any mental faculty into your active awareness, a function is only truly deemed conscious when you can direct it through sheer willpower, allowing its underlying principles to govern your overall perception of reality. Such mastery occurs when a process like rational thought transcends idle rumination, generating conclusions that hold absolute validity in your life, a level of sovereignty that empirically belongs to just one dominant trait at a time. Through the critical process of differentiation, you carefully isolate and refine this primary function, actively discarding irrelevant psychological noise to establish a clear, unwavering path forward. Failing to undergo this refinement leaves you trapped in a chaotic, primitive state of ambivalence that can completely fracture your identity, a tragedy frequently observed when intense societal pressures force someone to abandon their inherent nature, like a born artist being coerced into a medical career, leaving them fundamentally alienated from their own mind. Severe familial pressures often coerce young minds into adopting mindsets that fundamentally contradict their true nature. Imagine a deeply sensitive, feeling-oriented boy growing up within a household dominated by strictly analytical, thinking-type relatives. This environment inevitably casts him as an outsider, compelling him to bury his primary psychological function. Hoping to gain acceptance, he might pursue an engineering career just like his father, only to struggle immensely with both his academic training and subsequent professional duties, ultimately breeding a profound sense of personal inadequacy and failure. Eventually, this individual might experience an awakening, realizing that his genuine passion lies in human connection rather than the cold mechanics of machinery. He suddenly discovers a vocational direction that perfectly aligns with his innate disposition, a path organically designed for his character. Jungian psychology dictates that whenever an individual undergoes this kind of psychological falsification, severe neurosis is the predictable outcome, a condition that is resolvable solely by cultivating an attitude that genuinely reflects their authentic self. Fortunately, this distressing detour is not a complete disaster. Through this premature struggle, the person is essentially compelled to confront challenges that typically emerge during the latter stages of human development. Therapeutic analysis frequently assists these individuals in successfully reverting to their foundational personality matrix, allowing them to rapidly integrate these disparate mental tools and achieve an impressive level of psychological maturity. Under standard circumstances, our early decades are dedicated entirely to sharpening our primary cognitive tool, or the twilight years invite the slow integration of our least developed or inferior function. Attempting to cultivate this drastically incompatible inferior mechanism requires the prior stabilization of your secondary and tertiary psychological tools, which provide crucial structural support to your conscious mind. These complementary faculties reside directly on the threshold, separating conscious awareness from the shadowy depths of the unconscious. As Carl Jung elucidated, these secondary tools can only function effectively if their fundamental essence does not directly antagonize your primary psychological stance. For example, emotional evaluation cannot successfully partner with pure logic. If rational thought is to remain objective and faithful to its core tenets, it must deliberately filter out sentimental influences. While it is entirely possible for a person to experience logic and emotion with equal intensity, this merely indicates a state of psychological undifferentiation rather than balanced maturity. A supportive mental faculty must never actively wage war against your reigning psychological paradigm. Rationality can seamlessly combine with either sensory perception or intuitive insight, as these perceptive tools deliver invaluable data to aid the analytical process, whereas emotional judgment would only disrupt it. Ultimately, any supporting mechanism remains beneficial exclusively when it faithfully serves the primary function, entirely surrendering any desire for independent authority. Jung observed that these mental partnerships create highly recognizable profiles: pragmatic logic grounded in sensory data, theoretical analysis propelled by intuitive leaps, or perhaps creative vision beautifully colored by emotional depth and philosophical frameworks structured by sheer intellectual power. Identifying your own precise categorization remains remarkably difficult, primarily because you naturally project your desires onto traits you desperately want to exhibit, completely ignoring the ones you actually rely on. This phenomenon makes perfect sense, given that our minds relentlessly attempt to correct our inherent psychological imbalances. Consequently, individuals frequently try to convince you and themselves that they embody a persona entirely contrary to their genuine psychological blueprint. To uncover the truth, you must ruthlessly interrogate your own behavioral patterns, identifying your most frequent actions, your deepest sources of psychological suffering, and the recurring scenarios where you constantly feel utterly incompetent. These painful collisions with reality are flashing warning signs pointing directly toward your weakest psychological trait. Genuine self-improvement demands engaging with your unvarnished reality rather than clinging to a polished imaginary ideal. In stark contrast to your primary and secondary mental tools, this fourth, inferior faculty remains deeply submerged within the shadowy waters of the unconscious mind, permanently resisting total assimilation into your waking life. Paradoxically, this profoundly underdeveloped aspect of your psyche frequently guards your greatest hidden potential, acting as the elusive treasure that requires immense effort to unearth. It functions as the exclusive gateway, allowing repressed archetypal entities to cross over into your conscious awareness, proving that the exact wisdom you desperately need is invariably hidden precisely where you refuse to search. The esteemed Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz proposed that this deficient trait acts as a vital bridge, eternally orienting itself toward the symbolic and uncharted territories of the mind. Furthermore, she clarified that the specific direction of this focus, whether aimed internally or externally, shifts dramatically depending on the individual's core framework. Consider a person defined by introverted thinking. Their weakest trait manifests as extroverted feeling, meaning their unconscious energy will inevitably gravitate toward external individuals, who then become profound, symbolic representations of their own buried psyche. According to Jung's framework, this deeply submerged region houses the anima, or animus, which serve as the fundamental contrasexual soul images dwelling within every human mind. Consequently, an intensely private, feeling-driven individual might find themselves overwhelmingly captivated by highly outgoing, hyper-rational partners who perfectly mirror these hidden inner forces. People routinely forge romantic bonds with their psychological polar opposites, a subconscious strategy that grants them a temporary reprieve from the grueling emotional labor of wrestling with their own mental deficiencies. During the honeymoon phase of such a union, this dynamic feels remarkably blissful, effectively outsourcing the heavy lifting of the undeveloped mind to the partner and fostering an intoxicating illusion of total spiritual unity. Everything feels enchantingly perfect and profoundly romantic as the two halves seemingly create a whole. Yet, as the relationship matures, the exact same psychological discrepancy that sparked the initial attraction frequently morphs into a devastating source of severe toxicity. This weakest aspect of our character undeniably operates as a treacherous, double-edged sword within any intimate dynamic. Bitter conflicts erupt when partners abandon the pursuit of mutual equilibrium and instead aggressively attempt to impose their own dominant cognitive style onto the other, desperately seeking validation. They are ultimately horrified to realize that true comprehension has always been absent, simply because their minds operate on entirely incompatible linguistic frequencies. As this fundamental clash of psychological types escalates, whatever one partner holds sacred acts as an absolute invalidation of the other's worldview, inevitably locking them in a destructive cycle of mutual resentment and devaluation. Carl Jung noted that a person's underdeveloped traits, their inferior function, mirror the shadowed aspects of their character, a dynamic that profoundly influences the selection of an analyst. The primary responsibility of the therapist is to cultivate an adequate environment where the individual can safely expand their psychological repertoire. Rather than confronting these hidden weaknesses directly, the process must begin by strengthening the auxiliary functions, meticulously complementing a rational function with an irrational function, or the reverse. This deliberate, serpentine movement ensures the individual slowly builds the resilience needed to negotiate their way toward their deepest vulnerabilities. Professionals must resist the urge to solve dilemmas for the patient, empowering them to navigate their own psychological landscape to prevent the phenomenon of transference. Should the therapist assume a parental figure role, an absolute dependence forms, creating a toxic bond that ultimately shatters with devastating consequences. When a practitioner possesses a personality profile opposite to the patient, they must carefully veil their superior function and avoid presenting themselves as an omniscient sage, acting instead as a supportive ally. By going against their real feeling and feigning uncertainty, the analyst prevents the individual from feeling paralyzed during their initial, fragile steps toward self-discovery. At its core, the inferior function operates with profound autonomy, seizing control, attacking our sensibilities, and proving that we are not entirely masters of ourselves. It blurs the boundaries between our own identity and the outside world, creating a disorienting spin that leaves us vulnerable. Whenever this sensitive, psychological area is touched upon, most individuals revert to an intensely childish state, perceiving even the mildest criticism as a severe personal assault. Delivering blunt feedback in such moments only triggers profound bewilderment and defensive emotional outbursts, completely derailing any potential progress. To successfully navigate this volatility, you must wait for an exceptionally peaceful atmosphere, gently weaving slight criticism into a lengthy introductory speech. While it is incredibly common to lose your patience during this process and abandon the effort altogether, this inherent resistance serves a profound psychological purpose. As we navigate the turning point of life and begin turning within to face the problems of aging, dragging this cumbersome shadow into the light deliberately slows down the whole life process, which is precisely what is needed. It remains crucial to emphasize that any system of typology merely offers a gross indicator of human commonalities and differences, rather than defining anyone completely. The moment you label someone, you inherently negate their true essence and strip away their intrinsic humanity. Jung himself argued that classifying human beings into rigid categories is a pointless endeavor that could never genuinely map the uniqueness of the individual. While conformity and shared behavioral patterns represent one side of a person, their sheer individuality forms the irreplaceable counterweight. Nevertheless, the esteemed psychoanalyst confessed that he would never dispense with this compass on his psychological voyages of discovery. Bereft of a model of some kind, we wander aimlessly, like explorers completely lost in a dark cave without a light source. Every single thing we say, think, or do is heavily colored by our particular way of seeing the world, which serves as a direct manifestation of our typology. Operating as a psychological law of nature, this framework governs the entire reality of human expression. This analytical lens empowers you to observe how we function, determining whether our actions accurately reflect our judgments, specifically thinking and feeling, alongside our perceptions, encompassing sensation and intuition. When a disconnect arises between our inner world and outer actions, this framework prompts us to interrogate the root causes of that dissonance. It forces us to ask what these contradictions reveal about our psychology, what steps we can take to fix them, and what we genuinely want to do about the situation. Reflecting on his own typology during his final interview, Jung revealed the intricate architecture of his mind. His relentless scientific investigations and profound insights point to a dominant thinking function, though heavily supported by a great deal of intuition. Conversely, his relation to reality was not particularly brilliant, and he openly admitted to having a great difficulty with feeling. However, he made it abundantly clear that psychological types are never static, instead shifting and changing continually in the course of life. When debating whether Jung was primarily introverted or extroverted, observing his history places you on much safer ground. He eloquently stated that if external triumphs failed to provide an answer from within to the complexities of life, those outward circumstances ultimately mean very little and cannot substitute for inner experience. Because superficial events seemed hollow and insubstantial to him, he viewed his own timeline as singularly poor in outward happenings. Ultimately, he could only understand himself through the light of inner happenings, cementing the singularity of his life's journey.